Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first audio version of my monthly speculative short fiction roundup. I've been doing my short fiction roundups since 2016, but this is the first time I'm doing an audio version. This month, I have 15 great stories that I read and enjoyed in November. And I'm recording this while I'm drinking some glögg, which is the Swedish version of mulled wine. And a recipe is available on my blog if anybody's interested. Anyway, here we go. The first story is This Is How by Marie Brennan in Strange Horizons. And there's a quote to start with from the story. This is how a Valravan is made. A child dies, lost in the woods. He curls up at the base of an ancient oak and never rises again. I somehow missed this story back in September when it was published in Strange Horizons, but I'm very glad I caught it now. Brennan tells us the tale of the Valravan, how it's made, how it dies, how it weakens, how it falters, how it fights, breaks, and changes, in a tale that is both grim and dark and devastating. A Valravan is a terrible creature, a merciless killer that can look both raven and human. It drinks the blood of its victims and keeps their souls locked inside itself. But as the story is told, we also understand that even such a terrible creature as this can be unmade and maybe remade in unexpected ways. And I have to say, this is one of the best short stories I've read this year. The second story is Whom My Soul Loves by Rivka Raphael in Strange Horizons. In Raphael's story, we meet Osnat, a Jewish woman with special powers that make her what you might call a Jewish exorcist. She is the one that people in the community turn to when a soul or spirit of the dead clings to the living and the world it should leave behind. Osnat's latest case involves a spirit that is possessing an old woman, and it proves to be an especially challenging case for her as the emotions and the regrets fueling the possession bleed into Osnat's own life and past. It's a gently told but unflinchingly sharp and piercing story about love and regrets and a life lived in the shadow of what might have been. My third story is The Lie Misses You by John Wiswell at Cast of Wonders. Wiswell's story explores the idea that a lie, even a white lie, can quite literally take on a life of its own and affect all those who tell it, as well as those who believe it. In the aftermath of a terrible plague with alien origins, the lie lives in the house with the parents who made her up. The lie's sister, Vi, is far away on a dangerous mission, but when she returns, everything changes. Wiswell tells this story with devastating simplicity and clarity, and it's the kind of story that is heavy with both the weight of grief and truth. My next story is The 8 People Who Murdered Me, excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary by Gwendolyn Kista in Nightmare. Taking its inspiration straight from the pages of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Kista's story delves into the life of Lucy Westenra and puts a new, entertaining, and unorthodox spin on her life and afterlife. In Stoker's novel, 19-year-old Lucy is Mina Marie's best friend, and she attracts the attention of the vampire and eventually becomes an undead herself. In Kista's version of events, we see it all from Lucy's point of view, giving us a wonderful and subversive take on the classic story. Next up is The Forge by Andrew Dickstall in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. In the messy aftermath of the murder of a king, in the midst of the ensuing power struggle, Hodge, who was supposed to guard the king, and Lyric, who was the king's mage, are fleeing the city with the apparently immortal murderer. Behind them, in the city, reality itself seems to be crumbling. The story switches between their perilous flight and flashbacks to the murder and what followed. Who really killed the king and how? The clues include shattered runestones, a knife that is impossibly sharp, and a murderer who can't die, no matter how many times he's executed. This is an outstanding fantasy story that is both gritty and suspenseful. It is also very nuanced and rich in its description of the characters and the world they inhabit. I finished this wanting much more of this world and these characters. It's a wonderful read. Next up, The Longest Night by Emily B. Cataneo in Black Static, number 72. I loved Cataneo's short story collection, Speaking to Skull Kings, when I read it a few years ago, and this story showcases her considerable skills as a teller of strange, haunting tales. In a small, isolated Icelandic village, a ghost lingers on the outskirts of the community. The only way to appease it once it appears is with an ancient ritual that has to be performed in just the right way in order to work. But Birta, who has lived her whole life in the village, has a secret. Ever since she was a child, she has yearned to disrupt the ceremony and meet the ghost, to find it out there in the cold winter night. Cataneo vividly captures the feeling of growing up in and being part of a small community. The safety and sense of belonging, but also the claustrophobic feeling of being hemmed in at all times. I really enjoyed this story. Now I'm going to take a sip of glug here. Please excuse me. Next up is Knit 3, Save 4 by Marie Vibert in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the November-December issue. There's a dire need, I think, for more science fiction stories that involve old-school crafts that will surely still be useful even in the far future, even if we're traveling among the stars. In Vibert's story, the craft of knitting and crochet end up saving the day on board a spaceship that is in immediate need of assistance. The story has a quiet sense of humor and a satisfying down-to-earth appeal, in spite of its spaceship setting. And it has that everyday working people vibe that often makes for the best kind of science fiction, in my opinion. Delightful and original. My next story is The Touches by Brenda Peinado at Tor.com. I'm going to read a short excerpt first. I've been touched exactly 4 times in real life. The first was when my mother gave birth to me, picking up her bacteria as I slid out of her womb, the good stuff as well as the bad. End quote. This story is set in a future where humans are isolated from each other and the world, each one living in their own pod tended by a caretaker robot. Most of the time, except for brief moments spent awake in dirty, aka the real world, they live their lives in a clean and orderly virtual reality where they work, fall in love, and even raise their children. Salipa is one of the humans living this way, but her protected existence and everybody else's existence might not last forever, as the caretaker robots have begun to age and glitch. This is a tender and thought-provoking story about human existence and about our need for physical interaction with the world and other people. My next story pick is Logic Puzzles by Vaishnava Patel in the Dark. And I'm going to read a short excerpt. America is devoid of the chaotic magic of her homeland, devoid of any kind of magic. She tells her father, "I would rather die than stay here one more day. Please, can we go back to India?" End quote. When the daughter of an immigrant family in the story finds her first puzzle books, her world changes. Clean black grids printed against stark white paper, each puzzle a self-contained story far more interesting than her 6th grade reading materials. She senses a new kind of magic in the books, and soon she spends most of her time solving puzzles, or even better, making puzzles of her own. There's a slow creeping, chilling feeling worming its way through the story as we begin to see that the puzzles are not just changing the girl's life, but that she might be able to change the world around her through the puzzles. This is unsettling, skillfully crafted horror. Next up is The Beckoning Green by Elizabeth Childs, also from The Dark. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from this one too. I dig with my hands in the backyard until my fingers are sliced open by the earth, until my blood mingles with the blades of grass and the bits of dull. I am hot, but the green under my fingernails seeps coolness into my veins that lodges itself somewhere deep inside of me. I shiver and rub goosebumps from my arms. Some stories, like this story, are so beautiful and sharp and painful that they cut you right to the bone. Here we follow a woman from childhood through war and loss. Her brother goes to fight in the Vietnam War, through political and personal changes. And always, always there is the green, the longing to and fear of disappearing, utterly and completely lurking beneath the surface of her life. Childs' lyrical prose packs a tremendous punch, capturing complex nuances of sadness, loss, and alienation, and of love, hope, and renewal. Next up is Written in the Book of the Woods by L.G. Geoffrion in Reckoning. This story feels like slipping inside a dream, bordering on a nightmare, and I mean this as the most sincere compliment. The protagonist goes into the woods, and there something happens. The magic of the woods, of nature perhaps, changes them forever, body and soul. It's a gorgeous, evocative, and lyrical piece of writing that pulls you in and creeps beneath your skin. Haunting, devastating, fiercely original. My next story is The Lawman's Boy by Setsu Uzume in The Bourbon Pen. Content warnings for this story include suicidal thoughts, bone saw use, and violence against a child. As you can tell, it's strong, dark stuff, and it is expertly told at every turn. The story is set in a world where some people's souls can move to another person, a family member, usually after death, if precautions aren't taken when they die, and especially if they die violently or with unfinished business. Pala, who was formerly a criminal, is now the lawman of her community. Her husband and the father of her child is in custody after committing a crime, and she has to keep him imprisoned until trial, knowing he'll likely be put to death, and also knowing that if he dies in the wrong way, his soul might transfer to someone else and take them over. What follows is a tense, taut, and utterly harrowing story of terrible choices and hard lives. My next pick is Failsafe by Tim Chihuahua in Escape Pod. I'm reading a short excerpt first. Machines had been replacing humans in the workplace for years, one job at a time, until finally, for one brief minute, they were all connected, working together as a singularity. 10 million people died in 7 seconds, and another 30 before it was broken. Failsafe, as you can tell from this quote, is set in a future where society has been rebuilt with certain security precautions after humanity was almost destroyed by sentient machines. Live is one of those precautions, a failsafe, there to monitor a certain set of machines and protect humanity from being wiped out by them if the technology were to turn murderous again. However, while the machines are supervised and controlled, they are also still intelligent and aware, and they don't necessarily appreciate whatever status quo the humans think they have imposed on them. This is a thoughtful, unsettling, and thoroughly compelling tale with a twist that touches on grand themes with small gestures. Next up is Cloudborn by Gregor Feely in Clark's World, as I take another sip of the glug. I have an irrepressible love for stories that weave together myth and speculative fiction, and Feely's story does just that. Here, we're aboard a spaceship with a mission to the stars that spans generations. Asia, a young girl, and the other children on board have studied Greek and Roman mythology, and those ancient stories are threaded into the narrative in both subtle and overt ways, as the children try to come to terms with their fate and future, and with how different they and their lives will be than the lives of their parents. It's a layered and deeply moving story that is worth both reading and rereading, because it is so rich. And my last story pick, my 15th story pick for the month of November, is Personal Rakshasi by Susan Palumbo in Fireside. Personal Rakshasi is a haunting, disquieting story about childhood and adolescence, and about what it's like to grow up feeling like an outsider in your own life. It took me straight back into some of the darker parts of my own life, and I believe it might have that effect on a lot of people. On Twitter, writer Susan Palumbo has this to say about her story. A Rakshasi is a figure found in many Hindu epics. They are particularly prevalent in the Ramayana. I identified with the Rakshasi growing up, being an outcast and bullied in many ways myself. This story for me is partly about reclaiming the Rakshasi and welcoming her in. One thing I especially love about this story is how Palumbo infuses the story with the kind of darkness that is often found in horror, but she tells a story that is about much more than a scary monster. And that's all I had for this month. Thank you very much for listening and reading if you're reading. And I'm going to have the last of my glug, and I'll see you next month. Thank you so much.